Thanks for tuning in. You're watching Bourbon Battles, and my name's Joe. Hey, we got a fun episode for you today. We're going to talk about the Kentucky Derby and whiskey and racehorses and mint juleps and all that, so stick with us.
They're off in the Kentucky Derby.
That's right. You saw it in the intro there. Today's Derby Day. It's a bourbon holiday. Today's the 150th running of the Kentucky Derby. So what's that mean? It means you got to drink a mint julep. So we're going to talk to you today. We're going to teach you how to make a proper mint julep. We're going to talk a little history of the Kentucky Derby, how the mint julep got there, and why whiskey, bourbon in particular, and racehorses are so important and go together so well. So let's start this off. First of all, another Kentucky Derby tradition is a good cigar. I'm not allowed to smoke in the Bourbon Battle studio. So here, as soon as we're done with this, I'm going to enjoy this Rocky Patel Dark Star. So let me know in the comments what you're drinking on Derby Day. Are you having a mint julep? Are you having a cigar? What is it that you're doing? So let's get into this. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the mint julep in the Kentucky Derby, why we use what we use, and that kind of stuff. So the official bourbon of the Kentucky Derby is this right here, Woodford Reserve. So you've probably seen these bottles out and about in the liquor stores. Woodford comes out with one of these every year with this special label. It's just regular Woodford Reserve, but it commemorates the Kentucky Derby, right? This year's is, you know, this design right here for the 150th running. So I like to pick one of these up every year, and this is one of the very, very few whiskeys that I do not open ever. So they're just kind of cool to have. They look good on the shelf, so I encourage you to get one of those. I do happen to have some regular old Woodford Reserve here that I'll use on this mint julep. So as I make the mint julep, I'm going to go through this. I'm going to explain to you how I do it. There's a lot of different ways to do it. As with anything, I don't know that anything's right or wrong. Play with it and figure out what you like, right? So let's get into this and let's talk a little bit about the history of the mint julep in racing, right? So 150 years ago was the first, got to kind of hurry up on this one. My ice is melting. So we get into some measurements here. We're going to start with a ½ ounce of simple syrup. You can buy simple syrup at any liquor store, most grocery stores, all that stuff. I make my own, right? It's super simple. You know, you can Google that and find a way to make your own. So we're going to do a ½ ounce of simple syrup, and I do just a little bit shy of that, right? I prefer just a little bit less. And then we're going to take 7 to 8 mint leaves, right? I pulled them off the stem. The stems are a little acidic. We're going to drop those right into our glass there and muddle them. I don't muddle them a lot, right? So muddling just kind of opens stuff up. Just a little muddle for me. Just smash them around a little bit. That's going to open all the good stuff in there. And then we're going to go ahead and add our ice. Crushed ice is what you want to use for a mint julep. I don't have any crushed ice, so I smack some with a hammer in a bag just a little bit ago in my garage floor. So 2 ounces of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. And yes, to make a mint julep, it must be Kentucky whiskey. A mint julep will not work with something made outside of Kentucky. It just doesn't work that way. That's not what it's all about. So you have to use Kentucky. And because it's the official bourbon of the Kentucky Derby, I'm using Woodford Reserve. I would usually use something a little higher proof, but that's what I'm using right now. So that's it. That's your Kentucky Derby. This is a mint julep glass that I'm using, the silver thing. You can get these on Amazon. If you go to the Kentucky Derby, they serve mint juleps in souvenir glasses, and that's gotten to be a real big thing. That first mint julep was served in a souvenir glass in 1939. I only drink these one time a year, and they're good. It's not my favorite drink in the world. It puts you a lot in mind of an old fashioned, right? It's kind of the same principle. Derby Day, it's an absolute must. So, like I said, that first souvenir glass was served in 1939. So the way that came about, we're going to get into some of the history of the mint julep in the Kentucky Derby now. The way that came about was the first mint julep itself was served at the Kentucky Derby in 1930. That's what we know. We actually think it was served much earlier than that, but people were stealing the glasses and taking them home, so they made it a thing, charged a little more, souvenir glass. Now, these glasses are very sought after today. So we know that Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., who founded Churchill Downs, grew mint behind the clubhouse, and we have good reason to believe that that mint was to make mint juleps. So we think mint juleps has been a thing since the beginning. We know that it was there, so that's kind of the history of how the mint julep became so involved with the Kentucky Derby. Go back even further, mint juleps were served in the Arabic community in the Arabic times. Medicinal reasons. Of course, they didn't have bourbon then, so they used rum. So you can make this with rum as well. Just like you can make an old-fashioned with rum, and they're actually really good. So that's kind of how the mint julep came to the Kentucky Derby. A little brief synopsis of the history of the drink itself. So where are we at today with the mint julep and the Kentucky Derby? If you've never been to the Kentucky Derby, I highly recommend you go. I think my wife and I can start going next year. We've had commitments for the last long time, so we haven't been able to go, so we're really looking forward to that. But a mint julep today at the Kentucky Derby, and that souvenir glass will cost you $22. That seems like a lot because it is, but that's what it is. It's a Kentucky Derby. That's what you're going to do. So they were going to serve 120,000 mint juleps at this year's Kentucky Derby. That's a lot. That takes... So I said Woodford Reserve's the official whiskey, but Old Forester is what they actually use at Churchill Downs. And they don't make it like I just made it. They use the pre-mixed Old Forester mint julep jug that you can buy in the liquor stores, at least around here right now, right? So if you want to really replicate what you're going to get at the Kentucky Derby, buy one of those. They're not very expensive. But they're going to use, serve 120,000 of those. They're going to use 10,000 of those pre-made bottles, right? So there's 12 to a bottle. 1,000 pounds of mint and 60,000 pounds of ice will go into this year's Derby to bring you a mint julep. Pretty interesting, right? So that's that. That's the Kentucky Derby. That's the mint julep. But now it's always very interesting to me. I did this video a year ago and literally nobody watched it. I think it got 4 views. And it's real similar. Same statistics for the most part. A few of them have changed in the last year. In fact, the drink's $5 more expensive. But I talked about these things. So hopefully, you'll share this for me, right? Help get the word out, because I think this is a really fun video. It's some bourbon history. And if you love bourbon history, check out the Stave and Thief Society. Discount code you see on the screen there, 15% off the Executive Bourbon Steward course. That helps us. That helps them. Really cool if you're into bourbon history. Check that out. But, so the Derby's full of traditions. Bourbon's full of traditions and folklore. I want to talk to you about some folklore. Why does whiskey, bourbon in particular, tie back so closely to horse racing? Well, I love bourbon stories. And I don't get caught up in if they're necessarily all true, right? Because I think there's some half-truths in a lot of these stories, right? When fiction becomes better, right? Print the fiction, something to that effect, right? So why is bourbon so steeped in horse racing? It's a Kentucky thing, right? But why are bourbon and horse racing in Kentucky and all this? So here's how it worked, right? Here's how it happened. In the early days when bourbon was first invented, they needed a place to sell it. Well, there wasn't enough people in Kentucky to sell it to. So these people making whiskey in Kentucky, the new bourbon had to be sold. So they loaded up in the river system and they floated it down to New Orleans, right? So New Orleans was a big hub, right? Where a market, if you will. So you could sell your barrels of whiskey to people in New Orleans and really get top dollar for those things. So float it down to New Orleans, sell your whiskey, right? So there's a marketplace, right? We see farmers markets today where people gather and sell things. Very similar, right? The place that this happened to be held at was Bourbon Street. Did they call it Bourbon Street because of the bourbon? Yeah, I think so. So very interesting. So if you go to New Orleans and you're on Bourbon Street, that's where they sold the early bourbon. Of course, there's a lot of ties back to New Orleans and whiskey and bourbon in general, right? So check, going down your own rabbit hole, check these things out, see if I'm right. Very interesting. So you're an early settler of Kentucky. You've made bourbon whiskey. You've taken it down the river system and you've sold it in New Orleans. Now you have a pocket full of money and you've got to get back to Kentucky so you can make more whiskey, right? With your money, you can buy more stuff to make more whiskey, make more money. So how do you get back? Well, you walk or you ride a horse. So what was happening was these people were going from New Orleans back to Kentucky and they were getting robbed because people knew that they had money because they just sold their whiskey. So back then, how do you ensure you don't get robbed? Well, you have to be faster. So bourbon became lucrative enough. The people selling it were able to buy, when they buy their horses to go back to Kentucky, they would buy the fastest horse money could buy. And when you get back to Kentucky, you put your horse out, you feed your horse the byproduct of whiskey, and the fastest horses in the land would stay in Kentucky because you're going to take the river system back down, buy a horse, bring it back, and repeat. So these horses started accumulating on distilleries. These distilleries were some of the first people to introduce horse racing. And next thing you know, you have the horse racing industry, the Kentucky Derby, and Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Write that down where you write down important things. Remember it, tell that story, and tell everybody you heard it on Bourbon Battles. So, hey, that's the Kentucky Derby. Again, let me know in the comments. Are you drinking mint juleps? Are you drinking old fashions? What whiskey are you drinking? I will have a couple of these today. What cigar are you drinking? I'm going to do this Rocky Patel Dark Star. I'm really looking forward to this. I just got it. So let me know what you're doing. Let me know your prediction for the win. So I've correctly predicted the Kentucky Derby the last 3 years in a row, but I have not been someplace that I could wager any money on it. So let's see if that changes for me today. Hey, I want to remind you, the Derby's fun, horse racing's fun, whiskey's fun, drinking bourbon's fun. Do it with your friends, do it responsibly. When you can, do it blind. But whatever you do, don't drink and drive. We'll see you next time.
If you drink, don't drive, do the watermelon crawl.